Well, good afternoon. It's 4:32 here in Cincinnati, uh, and today we're going to cover Chapter 8 in the text, strategy formulation, functional strategy, and strategic choice. Uh, and then we're going to have at the end a lead into the discussion question for this week. Functional strategy, as the text points out, depends on the corporation's overall strategy. Now, functional strategy here, for the most part, is talking about business units and things of this nature. What type of functions we want to have a strategy for, what type of functions need a strategy, require strategy, and then whatever that strategy is, it has to align with the corporation strategy. If it's different, then we're doing different things, we're saying different things, and obviously that's not going to work. So it can be competitive. This functional strategy can be competitive. It can focus on quality. It can focus on attracting highly skilled and highly educated employees. Or, as the text points out, it can use a pull marketing strategy. Now, the text gives an example of Kellogg's using a pull strategy, but I like to use one a little bit different than that, and that's prescription drugs. For many years, the only way that you knew about prescription drugs was perhaps reading about them in a magazine, perhaps seeing something in your physician's office, perhaps hearing from a friend or something else. But in the last 15 or 20 years, drug makers, drug manufacturers have changed that philosophy. Instead of what's known as a push strategy, to do a pull strategy, to put advertising out and to get consumers, and I'm using that term consumer as opposed to the word patient, getting consumers to go to their physicians and say, I'd like to have drug X for my condition. Now, I suppose the example that I know best is a product named Claritin. Now, Claritin may be available over the counter now. I'm not too sure about that. But when Claritin first came out, it was an anti-allergy drug. When it first came out, it was advertised very heavily on television. And there was some research done that found that Claritin was no better and no worse either than its competitors in the same market, same other anti-allergy drugs. And yet it was the leading seller simply because of the advertising piece that it had. Setting out a hook, if you will, to those who are allergy sufferers. Now, of course, all of us saw those commercials, whether we were allergy sufferers or not, but sent out those hooks to those who were allergy sufferers and said more or less, hey, next time you go see your physician, tell him or her that you want a prescription for Claritin to take care of your condition. In addition, a marketing strategy can focus on expanding the market to gain a larger share or develop new uses for old products. We're going to talk about that in just a second. The product development strategy, however, is a little bit different. It can focus on developing new products and services for existing markets or developing new products to enter, new markets. I beg your pardon, I have something in my throat. Arm & Hammer, the baking soda making company, among other things, makes other things besides baking soda, but that's what we identify them with. Same as Kimberly-Clark. Kimberly-Clark makes a large number of tissue products, paper tissue products, but yet we most often identify with Kleenex. Same is true with the 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company. It makes a number of products, but we most identify with either Scotch brand cellophane tape or the original Post-it notes. So Arm & Hammer has done this, by developing new uses for bicarbonate of soda, baking soda. Agent can now be found in the company's toothpaste and other products. Ocean Spray has developed a way to market cranberries to different markets. They developed craisins and a few other type things. For many years, most of us associated cranberries with the holiday season, Thanksgiving and Christmas. And yet cranberry juice, not cranberries themselves, but cranberry juice, and perhaps cranberries as well, have been well known to help promote healthy lifestyles because of the acids that are contained in the juice, etc., and in the cranberries themselves, of course. So we see cranberries more frequently today than we saw many years. Of course, refrigeration has changed and product shelf life has changed and a few other type things. But we see cranberries more today and used more ways than they were in the past. A financial strategy may sound funny because all companies must manage their finances if they expect to remain profitable. Here, it's about how finances are used. Companies may want to pursue research and development or maintain a strong balance sheet. So normally speaking, you can't do both of those. Yeah, you probably can do research and development and have a strong balance sheet, but usually one overtakes the other. Now, that doesn't mean if you do research and development, your balance sheet's not going to be good, but it may be different. But using finances wisely, of course, can be a competitive advantage over others in the same industry. This is where research and development may come in. A new product development may come in. Of course, that's part of research and development, or an extension of research and development, and a few other things. So we can look at those type things and see how this plays out strategically for the company over a long period of time. Now, I just spoke a little bit about research and development, and here I want to talk about it as a strategy. We know that R&D is connected with both innovation and product improvement. Companies, however, fall into two categories. They are either a technology leader or a technology follower. The text contrasts Nike, the technology leader, with Dean Foods, which falls into the latter category. One way that companies can be technology leaders is to establish good relationships with their suppliers. That's somewhat of a new thought process. I say new, I'm talking maybe 10 or 15 years, but certainly different than we thought of years ago. Table 8-1 on the bottom of page 241 depicts a contrasting view of leaders and followers based on cost advantage and differentiation. And I commend you to look at that because that gives us some good picture of what we're talking about here, and puts some things into perspective. I'm going to stop here for a minute and go to that table so we can kind of look at that just a little bit. Cost advantage obviously is low cost production. Cost advantage is what Walmart trades on a daily basis. Differentiation, on the other hand, puts unique products that increase buyer value, as is mentioned here. And so we need to look at how we want to do that. Now, this is technological leadership, cost advantage and differentiation. And you can look on the other side and see cost advantage and differentiation and how it's done by technological followership. And I think the comparison and contrast is very good, and it should be a little eye-opening to you. Not so much that you don't know this, but you probably haven't thought about it in the way it's presented here in the text. and gives us a different way of viewing these two thought processes, cost advantage and differentiation, as it applies to a technology leader and as it applies to a technology follower. An operations strategy determines how and where a product or service is manufactured. The companies can use things like flexible manufacturing, mass production. We need to think of automobile assembly lines here, where tasks were very repetitious. I'm going to get it out in a second. Very repetitious, and the quality was low. Now somebody's going to say to me, wait a minute. The Japanese came along in the 1960s and started really beating the brains of the American car companies in the 1970s and the 1980s and beyond. And they used mass production, mass production assembly line, just like the American car makers did. Yes, that's true, they did, but they used robots a lot more often to do those repetitive tasks. And repetitive tasks are very boring. You should have taken some courses here with Union, or perhaps somewhere else that talked about job enrichment, job enlargement, job rotation, and things of that nature. To put things into jobs that can appeal to employees' not instincts, but into their thinking, and give them some authority, some autonomy, if you will, over task completion. And so that's what we found out in the 1960s and into the 70s, that while the Japanese were using automation like we were on assembly line, like we Americans were, using more robotics to cut down on this business. And of course, they had some other issues along the way that they worked on. I don't mean bad issues that they worked on to improve quality. And the American car makers did not do that. And as I was listening to a radio program the other morning, wasn't this morning because for some reason the radio station I listened to wasn't broadcasting, talked about quality in American cars. The fact of the matter is, American car quality caught up to the Japanese and the Germans some years ago. But that seed of doubt about whether or not Americans were producing quality cars still resonated with the buying public. And because of that, American car companies lost market share. Now they've gotten it back, maybe not back to where they'd like to see it, but they've gotten it back, and they do focus on quality. And I would tell you that for the most part, American cars, American-made cars, are as good quality as foreign-made cars. Perception, however, in some cases doesn't say that, but too often perception rules the day. Continuous improvement, which was an issue that I talked about that the Japanese focused on, implemented with success by Japanese manufacturers following a system taught to them by an American, Dr. W. Edwards Deming, the father of total quality management. The old story is that Dr. Deming was on General MacArthur's staff in Japan at the end of World War II, when MacArthur was more or less, and please don't take this as meaning anything else other than the way I mean it, sort of ruling Japan as an emperor. He had almost total authority. Anyway, Deming was seen by some Americans and some on MacArthur's staff as a pest because he kept harping on quality and a few other things. And so the story is that MacArthur sent him over to the Japanese to work on it, and we know the history if all that holds true. And of course, he did teach the Japanese, and they did take to heart what he had to say. Modular manufacturing. Think of this as prefabrication. Units are delivered when needed. That's part of the just-in-time inventory theme scenario. A purchasing strategy, obtaining quality materials for the operations units. The purpose here is developing good working relationships, perhaps going beyond good working relationships, whatever that next term would be, solidifying good working relationships, making your relationship very symbiotic. You scratch my back, I scratch your back. Now, we're talking here about people doing things nefariously to get business. We're talking about a supplier helping the contractor and the contractor helping the supplier. Focus could be on quality, could be on price. More often, it's on both. This also goes to a thing called sole sourcing, which was advocated by Dr. Deming. And sole sourcing simply means that a manufacturer would have a sole source of supply for a specific part that the manufacturer needed. And this sole sourcing is probably a little bit where JIT, just-in-time inventory, comes in. And the new development known as JIT2, and that's shown as Roman numeral 2. In this latter scenario, a supplier's representative actually works at the manufacturer's site and takes care of ordering after consultation with operations folks. This is not unusual. Some years ago, and I'm not sure if it still holds true, Walmart was the largest seller of Pampers, not only in the United States, but I think in the world, but at least let's talk about the United States. And because of that, 3 Procter & Gamble employees, Procter & Gamble being the manufacturer of Pampers, actually, as a matter of fact, it could have been more. I've always heard 3, it could have been more, actually physically worked at Walmart's headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas. And the idea there was to smooth the ordering process. Well, that's what JIT and JIT2 do. So the ultimate objective of sole sourcing is to reduce costs in all areas affecting operations. Of course, and as you probably are well ahead of me, sole sourcing has problems known as disadvantages. That's why, sole sourcing, if you're going to put all your eggs in one basket, what happens if something happens to the basket? What happens if something happens to the supply chain? What happens if your supplier's workforce walks out on strike? Any number of scenarios, of course, can complicate sole sourcing. So that's why multiple suppliers and/or parallel suppliers may be a better alternative. Regardless, having a good working relationship with suppliers is paramount to success. Now, in that latter scenario, you have 2 suppliers, and those suppliers kind of work together to help each other if one can't do the supply. So they're not competing with each other, they're actually helping each other through the process, because they both are going to gain from the business from the manufacturer. An HRM strategy. A low pay, low skill strategy leads to high turnover. That's something that's pursued by McDonald's. We always hear, now, when I say this, please don't think I'm demeaning McDonald's. I am not. I will tell you I am not a McDonald's customer, but I'm not a McDonald's customer because I don't like McDonald's. I'm a McDonald's customer because I don't eat the food that they serve for various and sundry reasons, all of them based upon health. Not so much healthy lifestyle, but there's some foods I simply can't eat. I don't digest well, and I have some issues with that, so I stay away from those places. Yeah, I could go to McDonald's and get their salads and things of that nature, and I've done that in the past, but by and large, I eat here at the office and don't go out for lunch. But McDonald's, and we always hear this, so I wanted to get that out of the way, get a little uh, qualifying statement. But we always hear about people, you want to go to school and get an education, you want to be flipping burgers at McDonald's the rest of your life. And there's not a lot of rocket science to doing what they do. They have a program method of their how they cook their burgers, how they cook their fries, and everything else. And they've been very successful at it. They are running into some issues today, but I suspect they'll be able to solve this. But if you have that kind of scenario, and they're not the only company that has that kind of scenario, a lot of fast food restaurants do. There are other low-pay companies around, and they have high turnover. So if that's what you want, that's what you're going to get. Now, most of those places have jobs that don't take a lot of thinking. And there's little training that's required and few, if any, skills. And so that's something that is just there. You don't have to worry about it. On the other hand, high technology businesses look for highly skilled employees who can think critically and can work without close supervision. So that's the yin and the yang of it, if you want to, antithesis, one on one end, one on the other. And some companies pursue a strategy now. There are a couple of strategies in employment. One known as employee job fit, where the individual has the skills required for the job, and that's how you hire. Another strategy is a culture fit. Does this person possess the characteristics that match the culture of our company? If so, we think we ought to hire this person because we can teach him or her the skills that he or she needs, but they have that cultural fit that we want because we know based upon that they're going to be a good employee for us. So there's a couple of different strategies, and you have to think about what it is you want. Sourcing decisions, and this is going to get us into our question for our discussion question for the week, and I'll expand upon that when I get to the end here in about 10 or so minutes. Have another firm manufacture a product or provide a service previously done in-house. Now my note here is to talk about this, but I want to wait till we get to the end and make it maybe a little bit more meaningful to you when we discuss it. Offshoring, on the other hand, now that's outsourcing. Now offshoring is still outsourcing, but it's different. Offshoring, on the other hand, is outsourcing production or services to a company located outside the United States. So as the book defines outsourcing here, as the text defines outsourcing here, it is talking more or less of doing outsourcing within the United States. And one of the things that it does mention is that you do not, repeat, do not outsource core competencies. The authors authors of your text, refer to a study that appeared in the Academy of Management Executive in May of 2003 that enumerated 7 errors made by companies that outsource. A list can be found on page 249 in your text, and I want to talk about 4 of them. Outsourcing core activities, which I just referred to. This is something that a company does well and sets it apart from its competitors, and that should never, ever be outsourced. This is what makes you better than your competitors. This is what sets you apart. This is what people see when they buy your product, or they think of when they buy your product, or think of when they want to buy your product. But you never outsource core competencies. Even if the outsourcer can produce the product less expensive. Getting the wrong partner. This boils down simply to failing to do what's normally called due diligence. Maybe we want to call it research here. find out if this outfit is going to be a match for you. Now here I'm talking, this is not necessarily the text or the research that we refer to in the Academy of Management Executive. This is simply finding out that there's going to be a fit between the two. The two cultures are going to fit well together, and there's going to be a good relationship. If there's not, then go away from it. Look for somebody else. Having a poor contract and failing to look for hidden costs. This is going to come back to haunt the manufacturer. So the contract has to spell out exactly what is expected and the consequences for not providing what is expected. And also this issue of hidden costs. So it is openness. And one of the problems that we have, and I'm talking about we being humans, we have when trying to do something with a company that is in a foreign country, is we have an issue of translation. We also have an issue of misunderstanding because of cultural differences and a few other things. There are many things that we made. I used to use in a different course a case study about a company that had a subsidiary in Mexico. And so it had hired a Mexican American, and they sent her to the factory and or manufacturing place in Mexico and figured that, hey, they're sending a Mexican down there and everything was going to be okay. Well, there are a couple of problems right off the bat. First of all, she was a Mexican American. Maybe we should turn around and say she was an American of Mexican descent. She wasn't a Mexican. And, she probably grew up with her mother and father, and I think she was, as I remember, a first generation in the United States. So her family had come here, and that she was first generation. But she didn't have Mexican thoughts and processes and things, those things. She probably was exposed to that by her parents, but she adopted Americanisms. And so she went down there and she didn't understand the culture. And then another thing was that the culture down there is very male dominated. And here the company was expecting a woman to go down there and tell these men what to do. How are they going to work? So it was a question here of the Americans not doing the proper research to find out what problems they were going to run into, and sending somebody down simply because she spoke the language and had a Mexican last name. They thought all their problems were going to be solved. Well, far from it. And then finally, not knowing how or when to end a relationship. That doesn't necessarily need to be spelled out in the contract, but somebody has to have some kind of an idea what we're going to do if we find something that maybe is not contractual, but we've got a big problem on it. How can we get out of this thing? So there's a lot of those things that need to be thought out and thought through before entering into any type contract. Strategies to avoid, the list can be found on pages 250 and 251. Follow the leader. Here the focus is catching up and not looking on long-term survival. We're going to catch up, but we're not thinking about long-term survival. There's nothing innovative there. There's nothing in that strategy that sets us apart from following the leader. Are we going to match everything? Can we match sale? I mean, not sales. Can we match price? Can we match a few other things? Probably not. So it's probably not a good alternative. Upping the competition battle might result in increased sales, but lower profit margins, which means it's not sustainable. Not in the long run. We're not going to be around for a while if we continue to do something of this nature. We're putting a lot of money into competition. We're not differentiating ourselves. That kind of comes that follow the leader, but it's a little bit different. So we can get into competition. We could up the competition if we differentiate ourselves by price, by quality, maybe a combination of those two, better delivery, better customer service, whatever it happens to be. We could become more competitive as long as we have defining strategy to help us become more competitive. Trying to do too much. It's the best policy to focus on what you do best and leave the rest for others. Go back to the original, well, not the original, but one of the original vision statements we saw in the text. Newport News Shipbuilding has had a mission statement. It's been around for over 130 years, I think it said. It said that we build good ships for a profit if we can, for a loss if we must, but we always build good ships. So it didn't get into something else. That may be a little simplistic because that's pretty much what Newport News Shipbuilding does. Of course, it does repair ships, bring them into dry dock, etc. But it builds good ships, and that's what we're going to focus on. Backing a losing enterprise, and this is simply failing to understand when it's time to quit, or as the old saw is, whether it's time to fish or cut bait. And here it's cut bait. We can't continue loss after loss after loss after loss when there's no reason for it. Risk is a big issue. Risk is always a big issue, and it's a big issue for any company, regardless of the company size. It comes in many angles, and it must be analyzed openly. What I mean by analyzing openly is it should not be done in a vacuum. The top executives in an organization certainly should analyze the risk before they send it out to someplace else. Someplace else would be a work unit or a business unit or something of that nature within the company. So they ought to have some kind of idea. But then they need to go out to the folks that are actually producing the product or service and say, okay, this is what we think. You tell us where we are with this situation. Organizations face pressures from stakeholders. And figure 8.2 on page 255 gives us some kind of an idea of the relative power of the stakeholder. And you notice in there we see the federal government and Greenpeace and local communities and customers and shareholders and creditors, etc. So they're going to exert some pressure, and any decision that is made must consider how each stakeholder is affected. So if you look at this chart, and even though it's called a figure, I prefer to say it's a chart, but that's probably a question of semantics here. We can see that the creditor is going to exert more influence than the federal government, even though we continually hear that the federal government has all these regulations and policies that restrict business. Now, I'm not going to tell you there aren't some, there are. But it's the creditor who is going to tell the business, maybe you should not think about doing that. You know, I hold your purse strings. I hold your bonds. You have to pay me back. So think about that. Shareholders, they're the ones that put money into the company to help by buying stock to help the company stay afloat. And they want a good return on their investment. So they are bigger than somebody else. It's interestingly enough, if you look at that chart, local companies or communities, exert greater influence on customers. And I would think that's probably not true. I think the customers probably exert greater influence on that, but that's my That's my point. By the way, this source came from somebody that's done some research on this, and I certainly have not done any in-depth research. My research is anecdotal. Regardless, we have to pay attention. What the stakeholder wants versus what he or she will get with X alternative. We need to think about that. What will they do once the decision is implemented? Accept it. In some cases, support it. That would be shareholders certainly supporting the decision, customers accepting it. What are the odds they will take specific action? For instance, excuse me just a second. Some years ago, Hewlett-Packard decided that it wanted to buy Compaq. And it eventually did. But there was a huge outcry from one of the Hewletts. Now, I don't remember whether the Hewlett was a son of the founder or a nephew of one of the founders. And he raised a big issue about it, and they had a shareholder vote, and he did not win. But it caused a lot of angst within the company. I would tell you, I think that since that time has happened, Hewlett-Packard has had problems finding itself. Carly Fiorina, whom you may know is running for the Republican nomination for president, was the chief executive officer at Hewlett-Packard at the time. And she was successful in getting that acquisition through. Some people call it a merger. It wasn't a merger, it was an acquisition. Successful in getting that through, but shortly thereafter, the board of directors told her to take a long walk on a short plank, and then there's been at least 2, if not 3 CEOs since then. I don't know that it all goes back to that business about Hewlett-Packard. About buying Compaq, but it could. It could have had lingering problems. Process of strategic choice. This boils down to an evaluation of alternatives, and if not done carefully, can lead to the following errors. A rush to judgment. Now remember here, this is evaluation of alternatives. A rush to judgment. So the first one we like, we're going to implement. We haven't thought about all the rest of the alternatives. Use failure-prone judgment, often caused by a stakeholder with huge influence. So somebody's saying we want to do something, and we're going to do something that's not going to work. Don't complete due diligence in the decision-making process. I've used that term due diligence before. You may prefer research, you may prefer evaluation, you may prefer analysis. It doesn't really make any difference. Just make sure that what you do, you follow through and get all of the answers that need to get. Some of this error business can be avoided by using one of the following strategies. Having a devil's advocate. Now, the devil's advocate is a person who is supposed to poke holes in the theory or the alternative that is being fostered and being promoted by certain people. Years ago, when we had a lot of royalty in the world, centuries ago, kings and queens had a person called the court jester. And the court jester's main job was to poke fun at what was going on. Of course, the court jester had to be careful, because if he went too far, and by the way, it was almost always a he was liable to wind up losing his head. But that's the object of the court jester. Now, this was put into practice years ago in the 1960s, early 1960s, during President Kennedy's administration. President Kennedy had a friend by the name of David Powers. And David Powers was put on the White House staff. And his only job, or at least as far as I can remember and I've read, his only job was to sit in on cabinet meetings and other high-level meetings and to be the devil's advocate. Does this make sense? Should we go forward with it? Did you think about such and such? Poke holes at what was going on. Dialectic inquiry. Here, two proposals that are diametrically opposed are presented for each alternative. And then we go through the process of evaluating the alternatives through this inquiry. Regardless of the method selected, each proposed alternative must be extensively scrutinized by implementing one alternative means that others are not considered as being viable. So is that correct? We have to make sure that it is. Success. The decision makers must have a clear idea of the decision's potential success. So when you're implementing the decision, going through the decision-making process, there's things that you do. And one of the first things you do is make sure that you're attacking the cause of the problem, not a symptom of the problem. For instance, to give you an example, if you have a sore throat, you most likely will have a fever. Not always, but most likely. And for someone to treat your fever by giving you an analgesic, aspirin or Tylenol or Advil or something of that nature, that's not going to cure your sore throat. So they have to find out what the cause of the sore throat is. Streptococcal infection, or you just have bruised vocal cords or something of that nature. You have to figure out what the problem is, and then be thorough in what you're going to do. I used to use an example of a car dealer having a meeting with his or her sales manager, and the sales manager says, our sales are down. And so the dealer calls a meeting of all his managers, and what's our problems? And I said, well, we don't have a good product. Somebody said, well, we're in a poor location. Somebody said, well, our prices are too high. Somebody says, well, our service is poor. What's the cause of the sales being low? It could be all of those. It could be none of those. So without proper evaluation, you don't have any clear answer, and you're not going to go anywhere with it. Consistency. The decision must align with the overarching mission and goals of the organization. You can't implement something that's going against you. Now, for instance, that a very good idea that maybe not mission and goals, but a good way of thinking about that is back in the 1980s when Coca-Cola brought out New Coke. New Coke was much different than old Coke or current Coke, as far as that goes. And Coca-Cola stated they'd done some research, done focus group work and things of that nature, and people wanted this sweeter drink. Well, in fact, people didn't want the sweeter drink. And New Coke lasted on the market 80 some odd days. Not necessarily not with their mission and not with their goals, or not aligning with those two, but they didn't do the things they needed to do before they implemented that decision. It cost them a lot of money. Fortunately, they were able to recover pretty quickly, but it still probably damaged them to some extent. Now, today's discussion question asks about outsourcing, whether it's good or it's bad, or what it should be implemented or not implemented. And as a lead into that, I want to give you an example of a good outsourcing decision. I don't know that the outsourcing is still in effect. I believe that it is, but I'm not 100% sure. Back around the turn of the century, probably a couple of years into that, Procter & Gamble, Fortune 500 company, headquartered here in Cincinnati, decided it needed to get out of the information technology business. Now, what that meant was that it was, providing information technology for its own company and an information technology unit, etc. And it thought that it would be better off that if it outsourced those tasks, that competency, which was not a core competency, by the way, because they felt like they didn't have the competency to do that and perform it well, to another organization that was well versed in information technology. So they entered into an outsourcing agreement with Hewlett Packard. Hewlett Packard would take over their information technology business, not business, but functions. And it turned out that it was a win-win for both companies. Number one, Procter & Gamble was able to shed itself of a business function that was not a core competency, turned it over to a company that information technology was a core competency, and every employee that worked for Procter & Gamble in their information technology sector, if you will, for lack of a better term, was offered a job with Hewlett Packard. And in fact, at the time the outsourcing agreement was entered into, all the people from Procter & Gamble who were in information technology stayed in place. They didn't move. The only difference was they became Hewlett Packard employees. Now everybody didn't have to move. They could retire if they wanted. They could go someplace else, but everybody was offered a job. So this turned out to be a win-win. Employees did not lose their jobs because Procter & Gamble didn't just say, we're not going to do this anymore, and hired some contractor, and the employees were at the mercy of that contractor as to whether or not they would be hired. Procter & Gamble was able to divest itself of the resources that it had divest itself of the resources it had invested in information technology. Now, yeah, sure, it cost them some money to do this, but they did not have that continuing amount of money to spend on employee salaries and benefits and things over a period of years. Hewlett Packard came in, they had a core competency of information technology, information management, and they were able to assume what Procter & Gamble was done, what Procter & Gamble had been doing without losing a step. So it was a win-win for both. Now, the other part of that is offshoring. And we know what offshoring is, and I want to just go back for a second and talk about outsourcing. We Americans automatically assume that outsourcing is bad because most outsourcing we're familiar with is shipping jobs overseas. That costs American jobs, and that's not good. What we have to realize, by the way, now, when I say this, I'm not telling you that I'm a fan of outsourcing. I'm not. But what I'm telling you is that in jobs that are labor intensive, that require a lot of labor, like linen mills, require a lot of labor, they simply are not going to come back to the United States because labor someplace else is going to be less expensive. Now we have to figure out, we businesses have to figure out ways that we can retrain our current employees to be able to do something else. And that's why you get this push to make sure that kids get through high school. If they're not interested in going to a four-year college, they think about a vocational school or a two-year college to get some background, because we're moving into a workforce that places a premium on education. Now, that does not mean that we don't still place a premium on things that people can do with their hands. We just don't place as big a premium. And even when people do things with their hands in the manufacturing and making of things, we still need them to be computer savvy today, because computers are used a lot in the manufacturing process. And so it's not okay not to have that type of education. So offshoring is moving jobs outside the continental United States, and we have to look at that. We have to think about that in several different ways. Uh, so that's the question. Think about the question, answer the question, make sure that you defend your points, try to reach a logical conclusion, try not to be emotional about it, uh, and say where it's good, say where it's bad, whether it ought to be used or not ought to be used. So 5:22, we spent the last 40 minutes talking about strategy, and we'll be back next week to do this again. So I thank you for your attention, and good night.